Welcome back to Bibliography 615. We're in week 2 now. And this week is going to be what I'm calling a lightning introduction to linguistics. So some of you will have had an introduction to linguistics class before, and I think I'll be presenting the material probably a little bit differently than you might be used to. Others of you have never actually taken an intro to linguistics, and so I wanted to give you at least a broad idea of what the field is about before we start trying to kind of delve into research. So this is my lightning introduction. And yeah, so why am I doing this in a class that's supposed to be about research methods? Well, we're going to be learning about how to track down, read, assess, and to some extent produce research this semester. But of course, it's going to be pretty hard to do any of those things or to pick a topic for your project without having some understanding of the kinds of things that linguistics is about, right? And even for TESOL or applied linguistics, I think I said this last week, but I do consider TESOL to be a part of applied linguistics, just specifically geared towards English language education. Even if you're in this field, the research that you're looking through and finding this semester, it might be somewhat holistic about like what is general language competence or communicative competence, rather than being focused on specific aspects of language structure. So maybe you're going to find this a little bit less relevant. But that said, even broad questions about communicative competence or proficiency or pronunciation or accuracy, so on and so forth, these can only be stated with regard to some notion of what the target language is like or what it's supposed to be like. And so in order to know things like that, in order to understand statements about what what languages are like, you need to know something about basic linguistics. And so this week I'm going to try to give you a bit of an overview of the areas of contemporary basic linguistics. There was another thing I was going to say about this. Oh, yes. And then the other reason, which I haven't written on the slide here, but is also important, most of our TESOL students end up taking at least one core linguistics class during their master's degree here. And so it's good to have some information about what those various classes are going to be about before you decide to take them. So hopefully this will be useful to both the linguistics students and the TESOL students in the class. Okay. So first of all, most of the basic linguistics that goes on in this department is going to be broadly in the generative linguistics tradition, right? So there's all sorts of different approaches to linguistics, and the generative approach is one fairly widespread, well-known approach to linguistics. It's broadly associated probably more with American linguistics departments than other areas of the world, although there are generative linguists all over the globe in every continent where linguistics is studied. Generative linguistics historically goes back to the work of Noam Chomsky in the 1950s and 60s, who is arguably the most famous living linguist, and he really changed the approach that linguists take to studying language a fair bit. In particular, Chomsky is associated with a branch of linguistics that has a focus on implicit mental knowledge. So rather than studying languages as kind of platonic objects out there in the world, generative linguistics studies language as a system of implicit mental knowledge underlying our ability to speak and understand particular languages, right? So it's not exactly about the structure of the language. It's sort of about the structure of our minds that allows us to learn and speak and understand languages in general. Okay. So what kinds of questions are going to be involved in this undertaking? Well, there's a lot of different aspects of basic linguistics, but it could involve things like asking what is English or Russian or Spanish like, right? So that is studying just the language on its own terms. What is the structure of this particular thing in this particular language? But the reason for doing that in generative linguistics is to get at a deeper question, which is what do speakers know, implicitly know here, that allows them to use their language, English, Russian, Spanish, etc., right? I'm using the word know here in a kind of special sense. It's about implicit knowledge. It's not that if I asked you how, subjacency works in English long distance WH questions, that you'd necessarily be able to tell me the answer to that. It's about a kind of knowledge that is embodied in the fact that you speak English and have judgments about English that look this particular way instead of some other way. So it's about implicit or tacit knowledge that speakers possess of their language. We call that their mental grammar, right? So at an even more abstract level, we can ask, we started with what is this language like, and then what do speakers implicitly know about their language? And then a more general question is, what is a possible language like? So looking across a wide variety of languages, what do we see about what's out there? In a related question, why are some languages possible but others seem to be impossible? And of course, it's very hard to know for sure that a language is impossible, but sometimes linguists draw inferences about this based on the fact that we've sampled so many languages in the world and we've never seen something like this or never seen something like that. So there's really a lot of different levels of questions in generative linguistics. And each of these have a kind of term or description associated with them. So in general, questions about what is a language like, these are often referred to as descriptive grammars. And in the Chomskyan framework, that's referred to as observational adequacy, right? If you can correctly pick out the set of things that, say, English speakers accept as grammatical sentences, then that is observational adequacy. The second question, right, asking now about what's inside their mental grammars, what kinds of structures do they associate with linguistic expressions, that's referred to as descriptive adequacy in the Chomskyan framework. And then these third and fourth questions about what is a possible language like, that question is generally taken to be the topic of universals, of the study of linguistic universals. And it's slightly different, related obviously, but slightly different from the last question here, which specifically asks, why are languages like that and not some other way? This one is the sort of ultimate level of explanation that generative linguistics is striving for. Of course, we're not there yet. There are some ideas about this, but it's not as if we've solved this problem. But that ultimate level of explanation is referred to as explanatory adequacy. And one of the big ideas in generative linguistics that's associated with this last level is referred to as universal grammar, which actually means something fairly different than what the name sounds like. In fact, I'd argue it's probably not the best name for the concept. It's not claiming that every language has the same grammar. That's not what universal grammar means. It's a way of seeking an answer or a set of answers to these questions of the form, why do we see these languages but not these other languages? So universal grammar is part of the answer within the generative linguistics tradition, and that's sort of the ultimate high-level goal of the undertaking. But that said, most of the day-to-day work that generative linguists do, just like every other linguist, is going to be at one of these lower levels of explanation, right? Most people are not working on universal grammar in their day-to-day lives. Okay. So here's an overarching question. What is language like? And by language here, I'm using the term now in this generative sense of the language faculty, where language is basically the set of mental abilities that allows a speaker to learn, know, use their language. Right? It's about knowledge and the state of the speaker's mental grammar rather than any specific linguistic behavior that manifests that knowledge. So language is going to involve conveying meaning from one human mind to another. Right? That's a basic communicative act. It's not the only thing we do with language, but it's a big one. Right? Getting a meaning from my head into your head. That's why I'm talking right now. How do you do that? It's kind of like a good magic trick. Right? Well, in order to do that, the first thing you have to do is that the meaning has to be externalized according to some agreed upon set of conventions. Right? You can't see inside my head or read my mind. Therefore, there has to be some way of getting that meaning into an external form according to some agreed upon set of conventions. Right? And so far, nothing I've said about language here is different from any other communication system, animal, chemical, human, whatever. This is how any kind of communication works. Now, in spoken languages, meaning is externalized in sound to be conveyed from one mind to another. Of course, there's also another large class of languages that humans use that rather than using sound, they use visual stimuli, namely moving their hands and arms and bodies and faces. Sign languages involve all of those aspects of bodily movement. They're fundamentally visual rather than auditory, but we think that the abstract properties of sign languages are an awful lot like spoken ones. They just use vision instead of sound. And again, so far here, nothing I've said is going to distinguish what I'm calling language here from any other animal communication system. Now, we do think human languages are interestingly different from animal communication systems, but the answer to why is going to be in the specifics and particulars, not in this overarching characterization of how communication works, right? So spoken languages, which are going to be the main focus of your MA program here, basically involve getting meaning from one human mind to another by externalizing those meanings in the auditory medium, in sound, according to some agreed upon set of conventions. Those agreed upon sets of conventions we refer to basically as languages. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about language. And when you think about language in this way, you'll notice that there's lots of little parts that need to be broken down here. Right? So we're conveying meaning from one mind to another through the medium of sound. Right? This has to involve some kind of a chain of events. Right? So on the left here, this is an MRI of my teacher's well, most of his head, including his vocal tract, right? And so what's going on in the act of him speaking to somebody? Well, here's some short ideas. First, he has to have an idea in his brain. He has to have an intended meaning in mind. Right? So that's going to be something that linguistics studies. What is linguistic meaning like? Right? He's going to express that meaning by putting some words in a certain order. And that order might have some additional structure to it. That's basically the topic of syntax. How do you arrange words in order to express propositions or meanings in language? Right? And then at some point, those words are going to have to be pronounced in a particular order, in a particular way. You're going to use your vocal tract to do that. So you can see in this MRI image, this lump here is the tongue. This is the lips, the teeth, the palate, the roof of the mouth. The back part of the palate's called the velum. You can kind of see the laryngeal cartilages here. This is where your glottis or your vocal folds lie. And so each of these parts of your anatomy are going to have to be used to create sounds, and linguistics studies that. What comes out of the front of your face is going to be fluctuations in air pressure. That's what these tracings actually represent. These are recordings from a microphone. A microphone is a device that has a little skin inside it called a diaphragm that bounces up and down when air pressure impinges upon it. And when you're speaking, you're creating fluctuations in air pressure. The microphone picks it up, and we use this visual representation to show that pressure fluctuating over time. So this is acoustic phonetics. How does the physics of speech and sound work? And this is also something that linguists study. And then if you're lucky, the sound waves are going to bounce out in all directions, and eventually maybe they'll hit somebody's ear. Right? Once it hits the ear, there's an extraordinarily complex chain of events that end up with you perceiving sounds in your brain. And that mapping is very complex and interesting. I'm not going to go into it here. But then, of course, how do you hear speech sounds is also going to be something that linguists study. Now, once we get past this point, we're going to go back up the hierarchy. Once you've gotten some sounds in your head, you're going to have to recognize what the words are. Once you've got the words together, you're going to have to figure out what the sentence is like, what's the structure of all these words together. So we're back into syntax now. And then once you've recovered that, you're going to have to figure out what's the intended meaning from that syntactic structure. So we're back to semantics again. So this is going to be a full loop going from meaning at one end to sound out in the middle, back to meaning at the other end. So I call this the speech chain, or I mean, not me, a lot of people call this the speech chain. And every step in this chain is complex and interesting. Linguistics studies all of them, every single chain, every single link in the chain. And so that's what I'm going to give an overview of today, of not every single link here, but several of them. So I'm going to break this into small parts corresponding to semantics, syntax, phonology, and phonetics. And so there will be a series of short videos, one on each of these areas. And this can maybe give you some ideas about what you might be interested in terms of specific aspects of language. So that is where we're headed.